So maybe we'll get started. I'm just going to start with a little introduction. I just want to welcome you all to this second lecture in our Catherine Kerr Vital Energy and Health and Healing speaker series. It's, as usual, wonderful to see so many attendees here and lots of new people since our first seminar series. There's several of Kathy's colleagues and friends and students in the audience. So I just want to give everybody a very warm welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Jones, and I'm an associate professor in the neuroscience department. And I'm one of the co-organizers of this series, along with several other colleagues from the neuroscience department and also the contemplative studies program here at Brown. And we were all listed on that original page that we had up that Kathy, we were friends and colleagues of Kathy's who came together to organize this evening. And we're just thrilled to have you all with us. So for those of you who weren't able to attend our first lecture, we'd like to give just a brief introduction of the mission of our series, and then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Larson D. Fiore, who will introduce our distinguished speakers for this evening. We have Professors David Palmer and Professor Nancy Chen. And Larson will give more information on the format of the discussion for this evening, as well as a little bit about our next seminar in the series. So this series was originally conceived by our dear colleague and friend, the late Dr. Catherine Kerr, and she was a true visionary in bringing together interdisciplinary fields to study the role of vital energy in health and healing. And in our last lecture, we gave a detailed overview of Kathy's history and her transformative contributions to our understanding of the role of mind and body practices in health. And we also discussed a bit about how we as a group arrived at organizing this series with the generous support of the Berkman Landis Family Fund. And this introduction, along with the extremely exciting lecture and discussion with Dr. Heine Fruhoff on the history of Qi, this was all recorded. And it can be found on the Contemplative Studies website, and we'll put that link in our chat here. So anybody that's interested in hearing more about the history of how we came together and what our goals are, and also that exciting first lecture, please do go to the Contemplative Studies website. So for tonight, I'd like to simply just reiterate the mission of our series. The Catherine Kerr Vital Energy in Health and Healing series was originally conceptualized by the late Dr. Catherine Kerr to catalyze a new field of integrated discovery around the role of vital energy, or Qi, in health and healing. Building off the recent advances in the sciences, as well as the long-standing scholarship in the humanities examining how contemplative practices, including meditation and Qigong, may promote health, this speaker series will bring together humanistic, scientific, clinical, and practitioner perspectives. In honoring Kathy's work and vision, the speaker series will provide an important forum to continue and deepen a critical interdisciplinary approach to studying the role of vital energy in health. We will accomplish this through exploration of current and future scholarship and research pathways and collaboration. So achieving this mission really relies on the participation of everybody here, both tonight and throughout our year-long series. So we're really thrilled that you're all here with us. And again, want to thank you for taking the time. We're looking forward to advancing the field with you all through presentations and discussions over the course of the year. And without taking any more of the time, I just want to turn it over to Larson, who will introduce our speakers. And we're looking forward to a very exciting evening and discussion after the presentation. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to echo Professor Jones, reiterate how wonderful it is to see so many people coming out to this event, so many distinguished guests joining us tonight, or whatever time it is where you are locally. And to thank our speakers tonight who are coming in from all over the world. It's really amazing how international these events can be now that we're all online. So it's my delight and honor to welcome our speaker for today, Professor David Palmer, and our respondent, Professor Nancy Chen, two of the world's leading experts on the growth and development of Qigong in 20th century China. Since 2008, Professor Palmer has been a professor jointly appointed by the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences and the Department of Sociology at the University of Hong Kong. He received his PhD from the École Pratique de Haute Étude, forgive my poor French pronunciation, in Paris, where he had worked with the eminent Professor Christopher Schipper on his dissertation. And he went on to become the Eileen Barker Fellow in Religion and Contemporary Society in the Department of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, before he moved to Hong Kong to become the director of the French School of Asian Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong between 2004 and 2008. Professor Palmer's research takes an interdisciplinary approach to questions of religion and society in modern culture. In 2017, we at Brown University were very fortunate to have him come with his friend and co-author, Professor Elijah Siegler, to discuss their book, Dream Trippers, Global Taoism and the Predicament of Modern Spirituality. The video of that talk is also available online for those who are interested in discussing it. For the reading circulated in advance of the talk today, he's revisiting his 2007 book, Qigong Fever, Body, Science, and Utopia in China, which chronicles the emergence and growth of Qigong in the latter half of the 20th century, including its interactions with science and politics, on which he will draw for the contents of his talk. Joining him is Professor Nancy Chen, Professor of Anthropology and a former inaugural director of the Bloom Center at UC Santa Cruz. As a medical anthropologist, her work critically examines healing practices and health institutions from a wide range of perspectives, including most recently on genetically engineered foods in Asia and abroad as part of a volume some years ago that she co-edited, Asian Biotech, Ethics and the Communities of Fate. She's also done extensive research on emerging and traditional healing practices and medical knowledge, including work on Qigong and its interaction with modern forms of psychiatry in late 20th century China in her 2003 book, Breathing Spaces, Qigong, Psychiatry, and Healing in China. So today, Professor Palmer will begin with a talk entitled Out of Ontological Bounds, Researching Qi During China's Qigong Craze, to which Professor Chen will offer a response before we open the floor to questions and general discussion. Following this, both Professor Chen and Professor Palmer have graciously agreed to return on February 11th at this same time of day, and when they will reverse the roles as speaker and respondent for continuing this discussion. So again, it is with great honor that I welcome Professor David Palmer and Professor Nancy Chen to speak with us tonight.
So, okay, so shall I begin then?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Larson, and also to Stephanie and to the Contemplative Studies group at Brown University. I'm really happy to have this chance to actually reconnect with the center, because as Larson said, it was about three years ago that with Elijah Siegler, we had the bounty of visiting Brown University and presenting, in a sense, the book which was the sequel to Qigong Fever, which was Dream Trippers, Global Taoism and the Predicament of Modern Spirituality, which was the story of what happens when American Qigong practitioners go to China and meet with Taoist monks. But today is really, it's going further, it's going back in time. So I'm going to be talking about Qigong Fever in post-Mao China. And so my talk is going to have three parts. The first, the theme, in a sense, of the talk, it's out of ontological bounds. And basically, I'm going to be talking about how do we deal with the ontological instabilities or falling out of the bounds of the ontologies which structure our thinking and our body and our action. And so the first part is I'm going to discuss a bit about the difficulties I encountered in my field work doing participant observation and practicing Qigong in China, which is actually something that I haven't really talked about in any of my publications to any detailed extent. Now, because I've been promoted, I'm tenured, and so I don't need to worry anymore about these issues. So I'm going to be talking about some of the issues I encountered in fieldwork. And second, I'm going to go to the social dimension. So what happens when this ontological instability occurred in mainland China in the post-Mao period. And the third part is going to some new ideas I've been thinking about recently on how to conceptualize or to theorize these issues. And I'm going to propose a notion of polyontology in order to help us think about how we can switch between radically incommensurable ontological systems. So that's going to be the three parts of my talk. So I actually first encountered Qigong in May of 1993 when I had just arrived in China for the first time. I had just graduated a year before from McGill University, and I wanted to, I had this idea that in the future I would conduct doctoral research in anthropology on China. But before doing that, I decided just to go on my own to China as an English teacher and just get a sense for the country and what was going on and find a potential topic for future research. And so I went to I arrived in the city of Chengdu in Western China, and I started work in a school in the rice paddies south of Chengdu, which was the cadres training college of the Sichuan Petroleum Administration. And so I was a teacher of actually people who were older than me. They were all petroleum engineers from oil fields in different parts of China, and they were all in this cadres training college for 1 year of English training. And actually, about 3 days after arriving in the school, I was invited by my students to a 代工报告, a Qigong lecture, where the Qigong master, two Qigong masters on a stage in the local cinema, gave a talk, which was actually a very ordinary sounding talk. But while they started talking, all the members of the audience, or many of them, started to fall into fall into various types of trance types movements and burping and rolling on the ground and everything like that. And then some of my students told me how they had been cured of various types of back pain and things like that after this happened. And within a day or two, one of my students, who was a geologist, it turned out that he was a Qigong master, and he was organizing Qigong practice in the basketball court of the Danwei, of the work unit, every morning at 6 a.m. And so he invited me to join these sessions, and I was just very excited about this, and so I did so. And there were also old ladies just outside the stairwell where I lived, in the work unit, every morning at 6:30 a.m. who were doing xianggong. They were generating good smells during their Qigong practice. So there was Qigong going on literally all over the place. And so I joined this Qigong practice group, and it didn't take long, maybe just a few days of practice for me to start feeling very powerful effects of Qi. Not only the sensation of Qi, but also my own student, the Qigong master, as he was going around the group of us practicing and sending us, he was sending Qi, and I could feel things. I could feel waves of tingling feelings as he was walking past. And within a few weeks, I was directing the Qi and its circulation through my body. And I have to say that this was an absolutely overwhelming experience. This is where it started to become a problem, because I had just discovered something that I had never even imagined that could be possible before, that I could interface with my body, just with my mind, that I could generate sensations, that I could direct the circulation of energies, and that these energies were incredibly powerful, that I just felt so strong. I just felt so energetic, and I felt that anything was possible for me. And so I was just utterly excited about this. And I wasn't the only one. In fact, that was the case for many of the people who were practicing Qigong around me. So, so this became this led me into the research on Qigong, where then I studied under a master, and I explored different Qigong groups and organizations and so on. But and then I started doing my graduate studies, choosing this as my topic for my research, having gone back to Paris. And then this is where I started to have a problem, because I wanted to conduct an anthropological study on on qigong practice, and on what was going on in China. But at the same time, actually, in a sense, what was really going on for the practitioners, and actually for myself, was something that was going on inside my body and their bodies. And so the most in a sense, the most interesting thing was something that couldn't be described, or that couldn't be adequately described in any kind of language. And in a sense, the most interesting observations I had were the observations that were inside myself, inside my own bodies, and inside my own experience. So this was the first problem that I encountered when trying to, what exactly am I going to be writing about if I'm writing about Qigong? But then the other problem was that it wasn't an individual practice, actually. If I was staying with these groups of practitioners, with my master, or with different other organizations, I was opening not only my intellect, but my body to their influence. I was literally absorbing the qi that they were sending. I was literally sharing the flows of qi with these people whose motivations were not necessarily pure. So in a sense, I was entering a deep space of intimacy, of embodied intimacy with all kinds of people in a highly complex social situation. And so I wondered if I really wanted to involve the depth of my body with all of these different people and organizations and agendas. And then I realized, and even the entire political configuration of China. So um, so it became very hard to manage. So in a sense, the the practice of qigong for me had kind of led to an ontological or a breaking out of the ontological security that I had before I had practiced qigong, where I lived safely within the Western naturalistic ontology, and the classical anthropological approach of participant observation was actually untenable, because the participation enters you, something enters your body. It's not simply an observation that you're in a group of people. You're literally swimming in something that does not exist in your own ontology, but yet you are experiencing it. Well, okay, so what did I do? And actually my Toby Nathan, who was at the time, my MPhil advisor in ethnopsychiatry, which was the subject that I was at the time studying, he wanted me to do a kind of auto psychoanalysis, and I didn't want to do that, or an auto phenomenological study of myself and my experiences, and I didn't want to do something so self-absorbed. So I switched and I went to the École pratique des hautes études, and I continued. But then basically both I realized that what was going on in China, and that what I was experiencing was something that it was something vast. It was something that was going on a societal level in all of China. And my own micro experiences had to be put in that kind of context. And my advisor, Christopher Schipper, he also advised me to not to do an ethnographic study, but to really document the history of the Qigong movement. And so that's what I did. And by doing that, it kind of allowed me to literally let go of all the methodological issues of doing anthropological research on Qigong, because I didn't need to do that anymore. I just needed to collect the documentation, to collect all the materials of that had been generated in the Qigong movement and to construct the narrative. And I have to say, I'm so happy that I was able to do that, because this becomes a really important historical document for generations to come. Much of the materials, this book, Qigong Fever, was written based on a lot of magazines, popular magazines that were being published on Qigong science, Qigong and sports, all kinds of Qigong magazines. They were kind of like pulp magazines, you know, and they were all over the place, but now you could hardly find them. And so I was able to collect a complete collection of all of these different magazines, all kinds of books that were written by practitioners, news reports, and so on. And so based on all this documentary material, and also in a sense nourished by my own experience, I was able to construct the narrative of the Qigong of the Qigong movement in post-Mao China. So in the book, I kind of completely put aside the question of, does qi exist and what is qi? And so I just, the story was, well, regardless of what qi is, a lot of people in China were doing a lot of things with whatever that thing was. And so I'm gonna tell that story. And so the story can be certainly told in a purely sociological sense, and it's very, very interesting. But at the same time, whatever it was propelling to do all of these different things. And so, well, we still haven't gotten to, in a sense, the crux of the matter. What is it that propelled these people to do all of these different things? And I've had some graduate students, Fabian Vinegar, who's now in Zurich, and Anna Iskra, who is just now my postdoc at the University of Hong Kong, who have done some studies. Fabian did a study on Zhineng Qigong, one of the major Qigong movements, which is also widespread outside of China. And Anna has done on the Shen Xinling movement, the body, mind, spirit movement in Shenzhen. And they've actually much more, they've been able to work much more deeply anthropologically on the interface between one's own experience as a researcher and the phenomenon that we're studying. And so they have great work that's going to be coming out in the form of books in the future, and I will certainly recommend their work. So, but my experience, what was interesting is that the kind of the sense of excitement and energy that I personally experienced was one that was, in a sense, that happened collectively to millions and millions of Chinese people, as they kind of had that kind of, they experienced this qi in their bodies for the first time. And that it just opened up these just incredible vistas for them. And when this happens to millions and millions and millions of people, it generates a huge social energy. So now I'm just going to go through the story of this collective experience of qi in the Qigong movement in China. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let me see. Right. So does everybody see my PowerPoint now? Yes? All right. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's see. Just one second. All right. Yeah. So Qigong is the practices, which are now called Qigong, have a long history in China. They've existed in many different contexts, in contexts of traditional healing, in contexts of martial arts, in contexts of religion, in contexts of even opera and acrobatics, in contexts of salvational religious movements, sectarianism and millenarianism. So these kinds of practices that work with qi have been widespread in Chinese tradition, but they were all kind of brought together under the category of qigong in 1949, even just before the People's Republic of China was founded, when Liu Guizhen, a cadre, a Red Army cadre, had been suffering from various illnesses in the liberated zone in the boundaries between Shandong and Hebei province. And he went back to his hometown on administrative leave or on sick leave from the Communist Party, and for his just in order to rest and try to recuperate from his illnesses. And there he met a local master in his village who taught him a method which is called Zhen Zhuang Gong, which is about, it's a form of standing qigong. And after practicing this for 100 days, he was cured of his problems. And so he went back to his administrative superiors and reported on his experience, and there was a lot of excitement about it. And so he was entrusted with forming a clinical group in that region to research this practice and to systematize it. And so it was him and his group who coined the term qigong as a modern category for this practice and all kinds of other practices which were circulating in the time. And so it's interesting that this happened in March 1949, so actually a half a year before the foundation of the People's Republic of China. And pretty quickly in the 1950s, the practice was institutionalized along with the traditional Chinese medicine, and it became an important practice for these highly stressed out senior party leaders at the Beidaihe resort, where the first Qigong sanatorium was founded in the mid-1950s. And so really this was a process which involved redefining, reconceptualizing Qigong, secularizing it, rationalizing it, removing all the cosmological references that came from Chinese cosmology or from Chinese religion, creating a new secular, integrating it with the newly standardized, secularized theory of Chinese traditional medicine, turning it into a clinical science where clinicians and researchers in white lab coats would do research on the therapeutic effects of Qigong practice, publishing journal articles, conducting clinical research, making it compatible with the political ideology of socialism. And so really turning Qigong into a modern category that is part of the modern institutions of health. So part of all of that, which was massively constructed in the 1950s in China. So this was Qigong as practiced in clinics and in sanatoria. In the 1970s, Qigong became more of a mass practice. And it's interesting that this happened toward the end of the Cultural Revolution, where the most notable example is one cancer patient, actually. So I heard that here at Brown, you are researching the impact of Qigong on cancer. So Guolin, a woman who had been suffering from cancer in the 1970s, she learned a practice of Qigong, and it had very, very good effect on her recovery from cancer. And so she started a group in a park in Beijing of people that she taught the same practice to other people who had cancer. And so it came to be known as the Guolin Xin Qigong Liao Fa. the new Qigong therapeutic method of Qigong. And so here we had Qigong moving into the public spaces as a mass popular activity, unofficial. Qigong was banned during the Cultural Revolution, but in the parks, in these small groups, it started to reappear. And so we had this the popularization of which is similar to in the modernized Chinese martial arts, the Tao Lu. So a single serialized, standardized set of postures that many people can learn, and so it can be replicable anywhere. And so groups started to form practicing the same method, although in different parks in Beijing, and it started to spread nationally quite rapidly by the end of the 1990s. And so by the end of the 1970s. And so with this spreading, so by the late 1980s and the 1990s, these kind of groups, this was a common sight in parks and public spaces across China. By 1979, Qigong started to receive very high-level political support from the state council, the Guoyuan, and top party leaders. Ye Jianying, who was one of the senior military leaders of China at the time and who had been instrumental in overthrowing the Gang of Four, was a Qigong practitioner, and he received Qigong masters in his compound, and so he was quite excited by Qigong, and he and others played an important role in encouraging the rehabilitation of Qigong after the Cultural Revolution and promoting research on Qigong. Now, so Qigong started to spread in the military at the time. And an important meeting was held in 1979 that, in a sense, re-legitimized Qigong. So the different clinics and sanatoria and so on reopened. But there was a new dimension now, which was seeing Qigong not only as a branch of Chinese medicine, but actually as a new science in its own right. And this was triggered by the supposed discovery of Wai Qi, the material basis of Wai Qi. So where you send Qi out of your body, the master sends Qi. And so in Shanghai, at the Shanghai Institute of Traditional Chinese Medicine, an experiment had reportedly been conducted where the material basis of Qi had been discovered. And so then this seemed to have absolutely revolutionary implications, because it's not only subjective experience of being able to control the circulation of Qi in your body and to send it out, but actually whatever was being sent out, somehow some instruments had registered something. And they had registered various kinds of electromagnetic waves or something. And so Wai Qi, external Qi, had now been proven to exist as an actual substance. So obviously, if this is true, this is a scientific revolution of absolutely historical implications. At the same time, also in 1979, there was the phenomenon of children reading with their ears. Actually, it's kind of funny now that you think about it, that this was actually a national issue of national concern in China in 1979. So what happened was a boy in Dazu in Sichuan, you could write Chinese characters on a little piece of paper, roll them up into a ball, and put this paper in his ear, and he could guess, or he could read accurately what it said. So, in the village, people were talking about it, and somehow the news of this reached the ears of a newspaper in Chengdu, and that reached the ears of Zhao Ziyang, the party secretary. China, if I recall, Zhao Ziyang at that time, he was still the party secretary of Sichuan province, and Zhao Ziyang got very excited about it. I think, and the boy gave demonstrations to him, and so he was interested in this, and so he promoted more research on it. And so what we had already in 1979 then was this confluence of three different things. One was people practicing Qigong and working with Qi. The second was finding experimental proof of the material basis of Qi. And the third was these paranormal phenomena. Now, what was the connection between reading with your ears and Qigong? I mean, what does that have to do with Qigong? Well, basically, so once this case of this boy, the boy who could read with his ears, was publicized, then, of course, in the Chinese countryside, there are all kinds of people who can do these kinds of things, And so various other cases came up, and then it turned out that some children who, if you taught them Qigong, supposedly they then they acquired the capacity to do these things. And whether it's reading with your ears or reading with your nostril, or, doing whatever, seeing through paper and things like that. So this notion of 特异功能, of extraordinary powers of the human body, started to become, people were talking about it, these paranormal powers, starting to do research on it. And then a link was made between those paranormal abilities and Qigong, that Qigong could stimulate the appearance of paranormal abilities. And so the idea then kind of spread that everybody has these abilities potentially. And through Qigong practice, these abilities could be developed. But most of them never develop it. And even children who at a certain stage in their life, they might have some of these abilities, but if it's not trained, then it would relapse and they wouldn't have it anymore. So basically then we had this nexus of Qigong, scientific laboratory research on external Qi and research on the paranormal, just kind of ended up becoming one conglomeration of practices under the name of Qigong science. And people starting to think about all kinds of interesting applications. So for example, sending Qi to crops, as we can see here. So you could enhance the agricultural productivity. And the picture in the bottom there, receiving Qi. In fact, from space. I had in the village where I was, in the Danwei where I was living, there was a young man who, a 21-year-old young primary school teacher who got into practicing Qigong, became very enthusiastic and excited about it. He became a healer who was healing people on the phone. And he also taught his students at school, the children, to receive satellite TV by practicing Qigong and just receiving TV programs with their minds. He told me that. He was very, very, very excited about it. This was the time when satellite TV the satellite TV receptors were being installed on roofs in houses in China. So this kind of excitement, so it became kind of like science fiction. And in fact, this was the time when, using science, the four modernizations, the 四个现代化, and using science and technology. So shift from the ideology of the Mao era, shifting into science and technology. That's what's going to be propelling China into its development. And you can remember these images of Shenzhen and Pudong that kind of looked like science fiction with these towers and different flying objects. So this imagination of China moving into the future in a very kind of science fiction way. And here what we had in Qigong was somehow you could actually embody that by doing all kinds of doing things that you would see in like Star Trek and science fiction movies, basically. And so the greatest figure of this was Yan Xin. He was a Qigong master from Sichuan province who became, within a few years in the late 1980s, became a mass sensation. He had mass Qigong healing sessions that lasted 10 to 12 hours that filled up stadiums of 20 or 30,000 people, where he had paraplegics who would stand up and walk, and he was giving lectures on supposedly Qigong science, and he ended up giving a speech in the headquarters of the United Nations. But while all that scientific or supposedly scientific research and discourse on Qigong was going on, a lot of people, and what was happening during Yanxin's lectures and many others, is that people would get into these 自发动功, the spontaneous movements, Qigong, falling into these kind of trances. And some people would end up talking 宇宙语, which is like glossolalia, and others were having visions of Chinese gods and aliens and UFOs. And so all of this, just this profusion of all kinds of ecstatic and mystical and trance states, which started to occur. This was also at the time when the martial arts culture was experiencing a boom. There had been the Shaolin Temple blockbuster film with Jet Li, and all kinds of others, the Kung Fu movies from Hong Kong, Journey to the West. So all of this, these images and myths of these martial artists who can, right, you know, Qinggong, they can fly, right? I mean, we now all these great, the more recent films show it quite beautifully. You know, you can jump from one roof to another, you can fly. Or you could, you know, the hard Qigong, the Yinggong, you could break bricks with your finger and things like that. So a lot of these stunts, which you could see in martial arts film, it actually seemed that with Qigong, you could actually do these things. And there were some Qigong masters who were giving demonstrations of these hard Qigong and claiming that they could do light Qigong. And there were even demonstrations of various types of Qigong tricks in the Lianhuan Wanhui, the Chinese New Year TV television extravaganza, which is every evening on Chinese New Year's Eve every year, where you have a lot of platform shows and pop singers and folk dancing and comic crosstalk. And some of the performers, for a few years, you would have also Qigong masters who would perform various types of magic tricks, basically. And so the figure of the charismatic Qigong master appeared, who was really somebody who could heal people by external Qi, who could even heal people just by talking on the phone. And so he was this master with magical powers, but he was also a scientist. He was the image of the master, of the grand master, the Da Qigong Shi, is somebody who heals everybody, but who is also like Yanxin. He's actually a scientist. His name is he's a co-author of the academic articles. He's in the lab. He's sending his Qi to the instruments. And so these, in a sense, this fusion of these images of tradition, of the magic of the wizards of the past, who then also become the wizards of the present and of the future, who are able to master these kind of science fiction style energies. And so this associated then with this was the notion that we're on the cusp of a new global scientific revolution that will lead us to this utopia where there will no longer be famines in the world, because people can practice bigu. They can through circulating qi, they can ingest qi. They won't need to ingest food anymore. So we won't have famines in Africa anymore. We'll be able to solve so many of the problems of the world if everybody could practice Qigong and acquire these powers. The health of the masses would be assured through the free practice of Qigong. And this is something that China would be at the center of. So the new scientific revolution would not be a Western one, but it would be it would come out of China. So it would really empower. but it wouldn't only empower the nation collectively, but the practitioner is empowered, feels a sense of power. And so so there was both at an individual and a collective level this very high level of enthusiasm. But this kind of ended in the mid 1990s. And I think it was also associated with kind of the fizzling out of the general utopianism of the socialist project. China moving from away from ideological imagination to real, technocracy in the real concrete sense of the world, of the word, and actually the disappointment. Well, all of these promises of they weren't realized. The utopia didn't occur. People could practice qigong, and maybe they could certainly have health benefits, but other than that, all the other paranormal benefits weren't arising. The scientific institutions, so many Chinese scientific institutions had gotten involved with doing research on qigong and with and kind of in the promotion of qigong and publishing all kinds of articles about qigong. But with the increasing integration of Chinese scientific institutions with international scientific networks and so on, all of this that's not very, you couldn't really get much respectability in this, and there were too many methodological problems in these papers and so on. So there was just a tapering off of the interest of Chinese scientific institutions for qigong, and also and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. But the skeptics came in, the American skeptics, SciCop, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. So skeptics in China invited them over, James Randi and others, and the qigong masters were unable to replicate their paranormal feats in the presence of these skeptics or skeptical masters. So it kind of fizzled at that moment. The qigong movement started to become commercialized. And so qigong masters started to become seen as just swindling people for money with all of these outlandish claims. And so the anti-qigong polemic became increasingly strong starting in the around 1994. Prior to 1994, qigong had benefited from extremely strong political support. Qian Xuesen, who was China's most influential scientist, he was the father of China's atomic bomb, was actually the main political backer of the qigong movement. He tried to create what is called Ren Qi Ke, the science of the human body, and he implemented a kind of censorship of criticism of all of this research. Sambu, there was anyway, which was against the criticism of qigong in the press. But this policy, Qian Xuesen, became old. This policy was kind of broken, or kind of came out of use by the mid-1990s. And so then the anti-qigong polemicists started to dominate the discourse by the mid-1990s. And then we had the rise of Falun Gong. Now, Falun Gong marked a significant shift within the qigong movement. So Falun Gong was one of the thousands of different qigong masters and movements that was arising at the time. And so at one level, it kind of looked the same, just one variation of all these different qigong practices. But actually, there was some very fundamental differences here, because Falun Gong does not talk about qi, or says that qi is a very low-level type of energy. But what we talk about is virtue. So a moral focus becomes really much more central in Falun Gong. Buddhist and other symbols, such as the Buddhist swastika, Dharma bodies fashion, become, or certain reinterpretations of these Buddhist concepts and practices became much more important in Falun Gong, very explicit compared to some of the other qigong movements. So in Falun Gong, rather than moving qi in your abdomen, it's actually the swastika that Li Hongzhi has implanted in your abdomen, which is rotating. So So Falun Gong also had a much more disciplined, we could say, form of public display of bodies, as we can see here in a park in a major Chinese city with the three Zhen Shen Ren, so the three kind of moral virtues which are central to the teachings of Falun Gong. So that becomes another story following the repression of Falun Gong. And with the repression of Falun Gong in 1999, following the Zhongnanhai incident, where Falun Gong practitioners congregated around Zhongnanhai, the headquarters of the Communist Party of China, completely surrounding it in a day-long stand-in, meditate-in protest. Falun Gong was completely suppressed. And alongside with Falun Gong, although not so directly, but all the other Qigong groups either had to disband or to move underground. And so that was kind of the end of the Qigong movement. Nowadays, it has kind of come back to a certain degree, and often more under the guise of Taoism or Yangsheng or other health promoting practices. And it is not as sensitive as it was following the suppression of Falun Gong. But we could say so as a mass collective movement, the Qigong movement ended in 1999 with the suppression of Falun Gong. So one of the important aspects during this whole period was the controversies over Qigong science. And so, and that was really the notion of 特异功能, of extraordinary powers, really became central to Qigong discourses. And so this really involved the ability to cure disease, the ability to live normally without eating through bigu, a kind of fasting, the ability to perceive without the senses, so what we would call ESP, the ability to predict the future, the ability to move objects from a distance, psychokinesis, and the ability to transform matter with one's own mind. These were some of the different types of powers which were conceptualized as 特异功能, as these kind of paranormal powers which were considered to be that could be triggered by the practice of Qigong. So basically, there's this kind of a structure then that for me, I see how this could contribute to this sense of this Qigong utopianism. So on the one hand, Qigong is something that really comes from Chinese tradition. But on the other hand, it's also seen as a science. It's something that it's empirical. You practice it with your body and you practice it. It's very systematic sequences of practice, very concrete, very systematic. And you observe, you experience and you observe what's going on in your body. You can report about it, you can write about it and everything. So Qigong is something that is both systematic as a science, something that's empirical, and it's also something that comes from ancient Chinese civilization. Now, then the discourse goes that this Qigong practice, this Qigong science, generates or can stimulate the development of extraordinary powers. Now, these extraordinary powers are also Chinese lore and legends of the past. It's full of all these masters, these wizards, these Taoists, these hermits, who, even in the journey to the West, all of these, the monks who have all of these magical powers. So through extraordinary powers, what we have is, in a sense, a scientific validation of all of these powers that we have in Chinese tradition. And so this then leads to, on the one hand, it leads to a scientific revolution, a new scientific revolution for the world. But this scientific revolution is one that's centered in China. So it will enhance China's power and influence in the world. And this will help to bring utopia to the whole world. So here is how the utopian vision was described by Zhang Hongbao, one of the main Qigong masters in the 1990s, that the world is currently pregnant with the fourth technological revolution, also called the fourth wave. This revolution differs from the three previous ones in that its central focus will be biological engineering. It's not difficult to imagine that in several years, when Qigong will be practiced by the entire population and when somatic science will have made important breakthroughs, mankind will not only enjoy full health and physical and mental vigor, as well as superior intelligence, but there will also be innumerable Qigong masters and persons whose extraordinary powers will be triggered by Qigong. Such a world may very well become a 神仙乐园, a fairyland. So what's very interesting here is that this kind of, right, science fiction utopia of the future is actually also goes back to the mythical dreams of the past. These the fairies, the immortals of the of Taoist and Chinese lore. So, but we had all the people, there were critics in China throughout the 1980s and 90s who were just saying, this is just absolute wei ke it's hogwash, and an utter embarrassment. And they did everything they could to stop it. And for about 15 years, they were unable to stop it because they did not have political support. And they brought in as I mentioned before, they brought in skeptics from the West. And so they joined the discourses of the skeptics that circulate in the West against these kinds of claims to the paranormal and so on. And so there were interesting arguments that were made against this anti-Qigong polemic. So one of the arguments was, well, we're doing cutting edge science. This is modernity. We're doing cutting edge modern science. So of course people are not happy. Of course people are resisting change. Of course people are hanging on to their old paradigms. But we're going into a new paradigm of Qigong science, of somatic science. So of course people are afraid, but we're going to push forward. And the other one was the nationalist argument. Well, this is something that we have as China. So don't try to cut it down. Let's push forward for this to advance Chinese science. And then there was the popularity argument, which is saying, well, look at hundreds of millions of people are practicing Qigong. It can't be an illusion if so many people are into it. And then there was the esoteric argument, which is, well, outsiders don't understand what this is. They can never understand. And even those, like people like Randi and these Western magicians who debunk Qigong claims, actually they themselves have Qigong powers. Their skepticism is powerful, and so it disrupts the energy field. And so that's why when facing them, the Qigong masters are unable to perform paranormal feats. This is very interesting. One of them even claimed that Yu Guangyuan, so an ideologue, a Marxist ideologue who was against Qigong, they claim that his Marxist theory was so powerful. So his Marxist theory had such a strong energy field that the energy field of Yu Guangyuan was able to stop the Qigong master from performing his paranormal feats. So that was quite interesting. Then there was the argument of fear, that basically the scientific institutions are afraid they'll lose all their jobs and everything like that if Qigong becomes true. Once it's proven, then so many careers and everything like that will go down the drain. So that's why people are against it. And finally, the reason why there are all these Qigong masters who are debunked and unable to perform their paranormal feats is that they're fake. Well, yeah, they are fake. And why are they fake? Because Qigong is true. So Qigong generates, it's so popular, it's so good that just like you have fake Mao Tai liquor. Why? Because Mao Tai liquor is so good. And so that's why we have so many fake Qigong masters. So this is how the polemics were responded to. So in a sense, we had in a very intense way a lot of the debates that we have actually in the West between advocates of alternative healing and spirituality and paranormal on the one hand, and the skeptics on the other hand. So this kind of debate occurred with actually many of the same arguments. It occurred in China as well. So now I'm going to go to the third part of my talk, which is really looking at the ontological problem here. So one thing that is really distinctive, I think, about and in a sense kind of puzzling about the Qigong movement in post-Mao China was one might ask the question, why this obsession with the paranormal? Why didn't they just focus on, just practicing Qigong and look at, keep focused on the effect, the health effect on it, and maybe the spiritual dimensions of it? Why go into this dead end, in a sense, of the obsession with the paranormal and being so obsessed with wanting to prove to get into this zone of the paranormal, and then having gotten into that, ending up determined to come up with scientific proof of it, and then being unable to do that, then ending up being defeated on that kind of battlefield, being defeated on that ontological battlefield. So we're looking at a situation of being in a certain ontological, a dominant ontology in China, which is materialist monism. And so under materialist monism, qi simply can't exist. There's no such thing as qi. And that's what everybody has been trained, and that's what everybody's learned. But then you practice Qigong, you experience something. Well, you experience qi. And so once you've had that experience, then it breaks the ontological bounds of ontological, the bounds of ontology. You kind of break out of that ontology. And then you're in this completely free space where there are no more ontological restrictions whatsoever. There is no ontological system or no ontological system that you have been properly trained in that allows you to handle this thing, which is called qi. And once you experience this sense of being able to control with your mind, to control this qi, it just opens this imagination that anything is possible. If my mind can control, if through my mind I can control this qi, well, where's the limit? Maybe anything is possible. Maybe in the journey to the West, well, maybe these things are actually true, these magical tricks. I mean, now we've experienced mind over matter. So what's the limit of that? So basically the bounds of one ontological system having been breached, then everything seems to be imaginable. Now, one alternative to this is naturalist dualism. So basically then the explanation is, well, okay, fine. It's just that you believe that that exists. So under naturalist dualism, on the one hand, we have the real, what exists materially, what truly exists on the one hand, and then you have your beliefs on the other hand. So this kind of dualism between objective and subjective, or between reality and belief. So fine. You believe in all these things, you believe in qi. But the problem is, for people who have practiced Qigong, the experience of qi is actually not actually a belief. Unless you say, well, you believe you're experiencing qi, but actually you aren't really experiencing it. So what does it mean to say that you believe you're experiencing something, but you're actually not really experiencing it, right? So the argument that you believe that qi exists, it actually doesn't work for Qigong practitioners. It's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of something that actually is quite physically experienced. Qi is as much a physical experience as belief. So qi breaks the ontological boundary of dualism. So that ontology doesn't work anymore. Now, so then, in this Chinese context, in this context of materialist monism, well, qi has been experienced. That means it must exist. And so it must be proven to exist as matter within the materialist ontology. So all of these efforts go into proving the material existence of qi, proving the material existence of external qi, and proving the material existence of all these phenomena that are attributed to qi, going all the way to all these paranormal experiences. So you have to fit it into this materialist ontology. But the problem is that within this ontology, the fact is that qi does not exist in this ontology, and it cannot exist in this ontology. And that's what the research has shown. But in another ontology, Chinese cosmology, actually qi exists. Qi does exist in Chinese cosmology. And in Chinese cosmology, qi is nothing special. It's actually totally natural, totally banal. There's really nothing special about it. Nothing even to get excited about. It's just like air. I mean, so there's nothing to be enthusiastic. There it is. So basically, what is something like Qigong? It's a practice of embodying Chinese cosmology. It's not a practice of believing in Chinese cosmology. It's about embodying it. So through this practice, qi comes to consciousness and it can be cultivated and circulated through the practice. So there, it's just a matter of course. It exists within this cosmology. So what I'd like to propose here, how do we work through these ontological boundaries, is the notion of polyontology, which is basically then under polyontology, qi simultaneously exists and does not exist. So basically qi exists in one ontology. It exists in Chinese ontology. It absolutely exists in Chinese ontology. And it doesn't exist in another ontology. It doesn't exist in naturalist ontology. It doesn't exist and it can't exist in naturalist ontology. Now, when we enact a certain ontological apparatus, so basically a certain disposition of your mind, of your concentration, a disposition of the movements of your body, a disposition of the orientation of your body in relation to other things, when you enact a certain ontological apparatus, qi exists. But when you enact another ontological apparatus, putting your body in relation to certain types of instruments and so on, actually qi does not exist. So the apparatus, different apparatuses generate the existence or non-existence of different types of things. So then, if we take a polyontological approach, multiple incommensurable ontologies can be enacted by the same person within the same body. But these different ontologies at a conceptual level don't need to be merged together. They don't need to be reconciled. They will remain incommensurable. So there's no need to prove qi under materialist monism. There's no need to believe in qi under dualism. No need to prove, no need to believe. Just enact. Enact the ontology that's required in the circumstances. So this is what I'd like to throw out as a way to think about these breaking beyond ontological boundaries. And so then we have the issue of polyontological translation, and this is what I think, perhaps when scientific studies are conducted on the neurological or the biological effects of qigong practice, for example, this is what is happening. So basically, one ontology can't detect or identify the content of another ontology. So a naturalist ontology, or conducting research under a naturalist ontology, cannot detect the existence of qi, but it can detect the effects expressed in the terms of its own categories. So we can detect the effects of qigong in the terms of biology, neurology, chemistry, or things like that. We cannot detect what the content of the Chinese ontology, and the other way around, Chinese ontology cannot detect chemical transformations, but it can detect we could say the results of chemical transformations in the form of changes in of qi. So under this polyontological framework, there's no need to merge ontologies, and we have to adopt a humble posture in which we recognize that all ontologies are limited and none of them can fully capture all dimensions of reality. And I believe that a link has been posted to the chat of this Zoom meeting, where I have a paper which is going to be published on this conception of polyontology. It's actually in a slightly different context, which is thinking about pluralism. So if you're interested in learning more about what I'm thinking around polyontology, you can click on that link. And also, I've also put the link to the chapter on Qigong scientism in my book on Qigong fever. So, okay, so that's it. I think I took a little longer than I should have. I apologize for being so wordy, and I look forward to Nancy's comments and to the general discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Palmer, for this really fantastic lecture that you've given us. It is gives us much great food for thought. I'd like to turn now to invite Professor Chen to give her response.
So let's see. Great. So I want to thank you all for inviting me to join in today's lecture as a discussant. And I want to say it was wonderful to view not only Professor Palmer's wonderful time travel back 30 years ago, back to in the days of Qigong, but also really to come back to the present and really thinking about this world of ontology and what that work does with regard to Qigong and experience. So I'm not going to take too long. I'll probably take about 5 to 10 minutes because I want to make sure that there's enough time for question and answer for Professor Palmer. I was quite taken by the preliminary comments before the slideshow about what seemed to be incommensurability between bodily experience on the one hand and knowledge on the other. And what I think is very interesting is that after a very, very detailed discussion about the history of Qigong and the Qigong movement or multiple movements, what we're left with is really also, what exists to the phenomenon, right? That there's still the phenomenon and how do we treat the phenomenon? I was really taken by the history in a sense, which was about the beginning of Qigong as neologism at mid 20th century. And then later through the late 20th century, we have a very different category altogether. And in the book, which Professor Palmer showed the slide of, there's really some very interesting discussion about the 4 layers of Qigong discourse. In chapter 4, he goes into, as well as in the article, about early animist notions of Qi as this, energetic field or energetic force. Then there's the messianism layer, which is how certain Qigong masters become quite charismatic and very, very powerful. Then there's the 3rd layer of modernist scientism, which I want to go into a little bit more. And then finally, the 4th layer of nationalism. So I thought that these 4 different layers were very, very useful and helped to guide me as I was thinking about phenomenon as a social phenomenon, not just a bodily phenomenon. And it's really fascinating how science becomes the most, I would say, the most contested layer, right? Because this is really where it's not just about science, but it's about scientism, the belief in science rather than the actual production of scientific knowledge. And then also the concerns about pseudoscience, right? About fakes. So even though here in the US right now, we're in the 21st century being concerned about fake this or fake that, China's been very concerned about fakes for quite a long time. So especially with regard to Qigong. So even pseudoscience or 伪科学 being unscientific was also a huge concern. So I do want to spend a few minutes just about what we've been presented with in the last part of this paper, or presentation, which is all about polyontology. And this was kind of a tour de force in terms of thinking about, I found myself doing mental gymnastics trying to keep up with, with the different types of ontology. And so my question is how might ontology be really about the work of categories and how categories create meaning, and then at the same time also undo meaning, take away meaning. The reason I say this is I'm thinking about the work by science technology scholar Jeffrey Bowker and the late Susan Lee Starr. They wrote this wonderful book called Sorting Things Out. And what they argue in this book is the fact that categories have immense power. Once they're created, or any type of classification that exists within the category, therefore becomes almost impossible to undo. So once you have a category, it's almost impossible to take that away. And so I kind of see that when you're talking about these different types of ontology, right? Where there's the naturalist, well, there's the monism, there's the dualism, there's the Chinese cosmology, and then there's paleontology. So my question is, do these types of ontology undo each other, or can they all simultaneously exist? And it sounds like you're arguing for the paleontology, meaning it's possible for all of them to exist, but can they coexist? Particularly in the space of contemporary China today. And then the other question I had was really about, can ontology be really about the work of culture? That what is it about the culture of modern China that birthed modern Qigong? But now in the contemporary moment of where 21st century China is at the moment, is it a very different space of such that by default, people have to engage in paleontology. So those were some of the questions that the presentation left me with. I didn't get the link to the draft that you had for paleontology, so I look forward to reading that. But in general, I just want to say that this was a really wonderful way to go back to think about what was happening in post-Mao China in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. That three-decade moment was a very, very special moment in which you could actually see different expressions of what not just Chinese science, but also the whole way in which you describe phenomenon of power, of being able to breathe and or engage in training that could bring on this phenomenon. And so I think that's probably where I'll end it here. And I know that Professor Palmer might have some responses, but then there'll also be some other comments and questions from the audience as well too.
So Professor Palmer, please feel free, if you'd like to respond to Professor
Sure.
Chen's question.
Okay, yeah, yeah, thank you. Thanks for those questions. Great questions. I should actually just mention that, so I don't know if it's possible to put that article draft back on the chat so that, because maybe it was put earlier on during my talk and it can't be found anymore, so that it would become accessible. And actually, I should just mention that the notion of paleontology with with some slight differences has been, I think, initially coined by the anthropologist Michael Scott, who was working in on the Solomon Islands, looking at some aspects of indigenous ontologies. And then more close to my own approach is that of Janet McIntosh, who's looked at in a sense, what I would call what she calls actually the paleontological reality of people who are simultaneously living in different religious cosmologies, so Christian and indigenous at the same time. And I just find that this idea really fits very well with what we could see in the Qigong movement, but also in Chinese culture and Chinese religion in general. So the first question, I guess, was right, the power of categories, and do these categories undo each other? So I would say basically, and I think this is where an anthropological understanding of ontology is very important, and it's different from philosophical understandings of ontology, because an anthropologically understood ontology is not only at the level of concepts, but it's also at the level of practice. So we have implicit ontology. So an ontology, just if we take it just basically as meaning some basic assumptions of what are the constituents of the world and how are those constituents connected together. So of course we have philosophical systems, so explicit discourses on what exists in the world and what are the connections with them. But actually, and this is what anthropologists do all the time, is we have implicit ontologies that we actually act out, whether or not we actually consciously have discourses on them. So I think an anthropological understanding of ontology includes both explicit conceptual discourses and implicit or possibly implicit modes of relating to the world in an embodied way. And so the implicit and explicit, or the discursive and the practical, are connected, but not necessarily in a coherent way. So, and this we could see a lot, like in the Chinese context. You could talk a lot about Taoist philosophy as a purely conceptual system and have no experience of no experience of this ontology, never embodied it. But then you could be practicing Tai Chi Chuan or Qigong. You could actually be embodying Taoist cosmology without having any knowledge of Taoism as a discourse. Now, these two actually feed on each other, because having practiced the ontology, then you could discourse on it. You could add to this discourse, and the discourse also guides the practice. So okay, so that's what, in terms of the power of categories, I think for me looking at it anthropologically, the ontology goes beyond conceptualized categories. So that's one thing. So do they undo each other? So, okay, so that's what's really interesting here, is that at a discursive level, the ontologies are absolutely incommensurable. They do undo each other, or they resist each other. So the Chinese cosmology of Qi and Western naturalist ontologies, there's just no communication between. It's impossible to communicate between the two. It really is like a the particle wave duality in quantum physics, in a sense. It's simply, and by definition, it's simply incommensurable. But our body, though, is not at the discursive level. And so these ontologies can, what's really interesting is that the body exists at a non-discursive plane. And so who cares about concepts at the level of body? So these concepts can draw out certain aspects of bodily experience and certain aspects of intellectual possibility. Other ontologies can draw out other ones, but through the process of drawing out, they also restrict and cut out. So that's why the explicit cosmologies and ontologies are incompatible, but at the level of the body, anything is, or so much is possible, we could say. So that's why and maybe, I don't know, maybe my thinking is kind of Taoist here then, because really, so then at the pre-discursive level, the Hundun, the chaos at the origin of everything, there is no concept. So who cares about all these discursive ontologies at that level? And then you were, right, so you're asking now, so in terms of the current situation in China, does that really force people to live in a polyontological polyontological fashion? Yeah. So yes, but I think that this is not really unique to China in the present, because actually this is, what's interesting is that this is, and so in my paper on polyontology, I'm actually looking at within Chinese religion itself. We have the notion of Sanjiao He, the three religions, or the three teachings in China. And people often talk about this as if it's syncretism, but what I argue is it's not. It's a polyontological arrangement, because these different ontologies, Buddhist ontology and Taoist ontology, are also incommensurable. They're radically incompatible. And yet, so what do you do? So we have a polyontological situation in traditional China. So in a sense, Chinese culture is very apt at switching from one ontology to another. And what's interesting is that you have problems when you try to either collapse the different ontologies. So in a sense, when you try to make all of Qigong fit with the naturalist ontology, that's when you're going to have a problem. Or when you try to have such radically, where, right, one ontology just totally tries to undo the other, to exclude all of the others, then you're going to have problems as well. So, but it's when you can have this zone of ambiguity where you can live one ontology and talk about another ontology, or you can, you know, switch from one to another. But it's when you have these zones of ambiguity where you're able to switch between one and the other, then there's so many realms of possibility can be opened up. And I think this is also perhaps the case when we look at the coexistence of different types of alternative medicine, therapy, and Western medicine, and so on in the West. I think we can also look at it in a paleontological way, perhaps. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both of you so much for your presentations and your response and these wonderfully engaging discussions. We'd now like to open up the discussion to the floor. It is a general discussion. And so you can do this either, we already have some questions coming in through the chat, so feel free to post questions there. Or if you would like to ask questions over the video, please make use of the raise hand function and I will try to call on you as you do that.
The birds are so happy singing away.
I don't see the raised hand question. Can I raise my hand like that?
Yes, please feel free, Professor Pelosi.
Thank you, David. This is a great talk, and of course, based on wonderful research that we've all very closely read when it was just published, and this is a wonderful continuation of it. I wanted to ask you about this, the question of historicizing this shifting of, from one ontology to the other. And I completely agree that Chinese religions are so apt at shifting from one ontology to the other. And, in the same, as you very well know, in the same temple, you see all sorts of different kinds of ontologies, and people shift and change from one to the other without really feeling that there's a rupture there. But I wanted to ask you more about historically. So, for example, when the Qigong movement was suppressed because of Falun Gong, all of those people that were practicing that ontology, did they need a shift? Did they shift that ontology to something else? Or in moments of historical, other kinds of historical repression, I'm thinking about, of course, the Republican period or the communist, 1949, the communist period. How do you maybe connect this capability of shifting from one ontology to the other to the historical surroundings? How does the historical political situation actually maybe force shifting of ontologies? Thanks.
Yeah, so actually this is a very good question. And wow, I think there's a lot that could be said about that. So just a couple of things that just kind of pop up in my mind well, because I'm actually thinking my whole thinking about paleontology comes from research that I've been involved in the past few years on a ritual tradition in northern Guangdong province, and which actually, well, this paper that I put the link has some description of it, and there's going to be more publications about it coming out. And this is really it's very, very highly, we could say, paleontological ritual system where you have a Buddhist section, Wentan, and a Taoist section, a Wutan, or a civil and a martial. So you have anyway, I won't get into all the details, but I guess what I want to say though is that in this a ritual system where you have two ontologies which are coexisting and which are incommensurable, but one of the ritual systems, the civil part, is actually associated with empire. It's associated with the with bureaucracy and with central imperial authority. And the other, the martial altar, which has a Taoist ontology, is associated with locality. And so in a sense, what we see is the polyontological combination is a reflection of a political situation. It's a reflection of the expansion of the Chinese state into locality. But the way that what's interesting is the way that both the civilizing, we could say the civilizing force of the Chinese state and the local culture, the way they have negotiated that is by creating this polyontological ritual life where neither exterminates the other, where they coexist, but one is presented as superior or above the others. Now, there's another dimension of this, though, is that I think here's where the body and ontologies of the body become very, very important, because an ontology of the body can be practiced without being verbalized. And I think this is why. So in the Chinese case, the most body-centered ontology is the Taoist, right? But the Taoist is also the one that's most associated with the marginal, what is politically marginal. So it's the local communities, it's women, right? And so this is, so a body-centered ontology is one that can be practiced and can be embodied without being verbalized. So you could do it even in a completely, where the ideology, the official ideology or the system of governance is under another ontology. So, so I think there's a connection between ontologies that are primarily discursive, which are the ones that are which are privileged by those in power, and ontologies that are primarily embodied, which are those which are a space within which those who are in the margins can express something different and can find another kind of power. So I think there's really something to be that's worth thinking about in this. And you know, when we think about the history of the martial arts and even of Qigong and Taiji Chuan and so on, you know, a lot of these practices were developed during the Qing dynasty, and it was a way for Chinese cosmology to find refuge in the body when under the Manchu under the Manchu regime, and again during the Republican era in China. It was also seen against Western, against the coming of China under Western domination. Chinese cosmology then finds its home in the body. And so I think there's something about the embodiment of cosmology and a position of political subalternity or marginality, which I think is really worth exploring. Then the other question was about, well, what about now after the suppression of Falun Gong? So, right, as a organized cultural movement, the Qigong movement doesn't exist in China anymore. But these ontologies, well, what's interesting is, although I haven't really studied it systematically, but from what I've observed, so actually it's interesting, Qigong still exists, but it's for foreigners, right? So the Qigong Research Institute of Shanghai and other and the sanatorium in Beidaihe have been reopened. They're active, and they're mostly actually catering to foreign audiences where it's okay. So it's okay to disseminate Qigong overseas. But through that, it has regained some legitimacy in China as well. So I remember when after I did my research on Qigong, for many years, I never mentioned it when I was in China because it was obviously, because of Falun, completely a sensitive topic. But now I could talk about it. It's not a problem. But actually in China, though, what I got the impression is, Taoism has actually, the Yangsheng, the promotion of Taoist Yangsheng practices has become more, has developed very significantly. And so a lot of Qigong is now under the guise of Taoism. Maybe found its home again under Taoism and can be legitimately conducted under the label of Taoism, and not so much under the name of Qigong, but Yangsheng, Taoist Yangsheng. So a lot of the same practices, that's where you'll find them. And another thing is in the body, mind, spirit, or the body, heart, soul, the Shen Xinling movement. But what's interesting there is that some of these Chinese cosmologies, I mean, Qigong as Qigong, under the name of Qigong, is not widely practiced in the Shen Xinling movement, but a lot of practices of meditation and a lot of the similar types of practices are there, but they're imported from India and from the Western New Age movement. So there's a fascinating circulation that's going on here. And there's something about the, I think Qigong among the cosmopolitan kind of upper middle class or middle class practitioners in urban China. And I'm speaking totally based on my student Anna Iskra's research here, she did her research in Shenzhen. These cosmopolitan middle class populations, they are not attracted by the kind of hantu, the kind of too localized and not cosmopolitan, right? Too of that flavor of Qigong, but they like the yoga and the Indian stuff is very cosmopolitan. It's been marketed it's been successfully marketed in the West, packaged as cosmopolitan middle class practice, and it comes back to China in that way. And also some gurus from India had probably until last year when the relationship between India started to go bad. But there was a lot of circulation between India and China among these practitioners. So a lot of these energy-based, similar types of cosmology you would find in the Shen Xinling movement. Yeah.
Thank you.
I see Professor Nedisup has your hand up, so please go ahead.
Thank you. So this is picking up off of the questions that Elena raised, and then I think you sort of alluded to bits of it in the answer that you just gave. But so you've spoken about embodied polyontology, and polyontology is found in ritual. But I'm wondering what you think about what happens to polyontology, or as it's found in institutions, or can it be found in institutions? Because it strikes me that once when we talk about this history of categories, as Professor Chen mentioned, that's where the hardening of categories and the sort of the resorting to these manufactured histories tends to happen in institutions, whether it's religious or governmental or medical, is where these created sort of histories or manufactured traditions happen. But what do you think the prospect is for paleontologies in any institutions that you may think are relevant to the current practice of Qigong or the utilization of Qigong? Institution, however you might want to define it.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, actually, that's a good question. Well, maybe because an institution itself is also it is part of an ontology in an anthropological sense, right? So let's say a modern academic institution is really, it organizes bodies, and it organizes the relationship between bodies, between discourses, between bodies and chairs and tables and computers and things in a certain way, which is really part of a certain ontology. And it also is a system for generating discourses, which is really within that kind of ontology. And so I don't know if it's even possible, for at a so I don't know what the possibility. No, well, actually, what I would say is that that generates the requirement for paleontology. Why? Because the discourses generated within that institution must be within a certain ontology. So then if you're doing something else, and that's exactly what I think is being done, I don't know, maybe our colleagues at Stephanie, you could say what you think. But if you're doing research on Qigong practitioners and you're observing their brain, so basically you have people who are engaged, they are engaged in the Chinese ontology, but you're looking at this, but you're then translating the effects of that into the naturalist ontology. So it is a paleontological situation, and that's the only one, perhaps that's the only one that's possible. At least, you know, because people will try, and they do try, to create theoretical synthesis of, let's say, Chinese medicine and Western medicine and things like that. And so there are many attempts to do so. But what's interesting is that none of those attempts has actually really had gained any traction. They're all idiosyncratic. And I think it's because of the institution. Any institution is literally an embodiment of one ontology. It cannot, so an individual can create an individualized synthesis, but the institution can accept that in the name of diversity, but the institution can never completely absorb that. So what you will have then is so paleontology precisely exists because institutions are themselves embodiments of one ontology. So if for something else to come into it, it will be precisely in that switching mode. So you could be sitting at your computer and actually literally in your body, you are practicing the Chinese ontology, but you're engaging with your computer according to a naturalist ontology. So, right.
I think for me, coming at it from the scientific perspective too, is really the awareness of what the ontologies are, I think is part of what, as a group, we need to be learning from each other. And then starting with that understanding, then we figure out how can we make bridges between these ontologies among people that want to make those bridges. Because I think a lot of the fraction is coming from people that are feeling in one camp or the other, but in an institution that will allow you to have the flexibility of thinking of different camps, I think that's a way in which we can hopefully move things forward. And become, for me, it's still quite definitional and categories, and really putting it into camps of definition in service of thinking about, okay, if we know those definitions, how do we bring them together among groups that want to bring them together and not have infractions of, no, it's this way or that way. But I think the knowledge is really important of the ontologies, is really important in order for us to move forward.
Right. And the different systems, ontological systems of knowledge are always evolving, so they can absorb within their own internal logic, while Western thinking, you know, is moving beyond dualism, is moving in certain directions according to its own logic and its own pattern of development. And similarly with Chinese thought and so on. So yeah.
So we have about 12 minutes left, and I thought maybe we could turn to some of the questions that have been posted in the chat so far. I'd like to start first. Esha had a question related to the investigation of Qigong. And actually, I was wondering, Esha, would you like to talk about your question in the chat directly?
Sure, yeah. So I was really fascinated by your discussion of how participant observation was insufficient in your investigation of Qigong. And so I was wondering, do you think, like, just how in anthropology there are some student techniques like, doing participant observation, conducting interviews, taking, kinship charts, etc. Are there equally effective methodological approaches specifically suited to conduct or investigating contemplative practices? And if not, what aspects, having researched contemplative practice, do you think would be important to include when constructing such an approach?
Yeah. Well, I guess with my students, I mean, I've encouraged them to really push the envelope. So and I've had students who, okay, I guess the methodological starting point for me in looking at this is actually the work of Georges Devreux, who was a French, the initiator of the French school of ethno-psychoanalysis. And he had a very important methodological principle, which is the principle of countertransference in anthropological research, which is basically to become aware of the anxiety that is generated be aware of your own anxiety that is generated when you are in the field, and use that anxiety. So don't avoid the anxiety, but actually use that anxiety as a productive methodological tool. In other words, why are you anxious? Why are you feeling and any successful field research should produce anxiety. If it's not producing anxiety, that means that you're not learning anything, right? So that boundary, that boundary where the anxiety is produced is actually the starting of a productive engagement with the reality that is being studied. And so and so I encourage, so I mean, in a sense, okay, but I think the difference is when I engaged in my own field research, then I had a hard time dealing with my anxiety. And in a sense, it was solved because the direction of the research went into using documentary material. So I didn't really need to resolve it at that stage. But then I thought about this a lot when I was guiding my own students. And I think that the guidance of the advisor is really important in giving support to the student in being able to deal with these anxieties and to keep pushing forward. And so that's what I've done. And I think the results have been very, very interesting. So you need to be able to use the anxiety as a way to generate data or as a way to generate insights, but also you need support so that you can, and support, I guess, because I know what they're experiencing. So I guess that's the difference, right? When my students are experiencing things that are outside of our naturalist ontology, well, it's hard to handle if you're all alone out there. But so that I think that support is very, very important. And what's been interesting is I've had students who are deeply committed to the kind of practice that they're studies, and others who are not, and who actually are completely skeptical about the whole thing. But either way, regardless of what the level of their anxieties are or their commitments are, I encourage them to go all the way, because ultimately, I mean, anthropology really is about discovering new other worlds. So if you're not going to do that, what's the point?
So we have one more question, enough time for one more question from the chat. So Alex Guerin has asked about the notions of productive misunderstandings or working misunderstandings. And I was wondering, actually, if you're still here, if you'd like to ask your question live to Professor Palmer.
Sure, thanks, Larson. Hi, I'm an anthropologist from Heyrman University. And my question is, when I was listening, David, to your wonderful talk, which, you know, particularly the aspects that highlight the tensions between naturalism science and this kind of explosive ontology of Taoism in the body, how you outlined all the tensions and polemics and clashes that played out on the social field. But I'm wondering about, did you see examples of what Marshall Salins calls productive misunderstandings, which is when incommensurable cultural systems come together and they kind of misunderstand each other in ways that are productive positively to each? So in my own field work, studying shamans in Peru, an example would be, you know, these naturalists coming in, understanding their, excuse me, their visions in terms of personal trauma in this psychological kind of scientific way. And the shamans understanding it in terms of an animistic ontology, in terms of soul loss and the spirit being captured by spirits up in the hills. But when they encounter and speak to each other, it's in a compatible, productive form of misunderstanding. So I'm wondering if this has been a part of your research at all, thinking about these kind of productive misunderstandings between incommensurable ontologies.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's all about that, you know, maybe it's just all about that. So, and that's why I don't, there's one kind of radical anthropological discourse or anti-anthropological discourse, in a sense, which would say that, well, it's actually impossible to study another culture because you will always be an outsider, so to speak, right? So it's in a sense, it's saying that anything is going to be a misunderstanding. But exactly, but I mean, that's the misunderstanding that produces new understanding, you know? So I think, so I'd say everything is a kind of productive misunderstanding. Yeah.
All right, so that seems, well, we're on productive rather than unproductive misunderstandings. Maybe this is a good time to wrap up for today. I'd like to thank again our speaker, Professor David Palmer, and Professor Nancy Chen, who offered a wonderful response today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who came to join us in the audience, so many distinguished guests today. And I'd like to remind everyone again that we will be having kind of a reprisal of this on February 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, US. Where Professor Chen will give a talk and Professor Palmer will act as a discussant. So we hope, if that fits with your schedule, that many of you will come join us again. So thank you again for your time, and best wishes to everyone.